Good morning, guys. Larry the tractor guy here. Got the service truck started up, ready to go this morning. A little windy out here in southwest Oklahoma, but it is a nice 64 degrees out this morning. I'd like to show you real quick one of my barn find projects that I picked up this past weekend. It's a little John Deere 620 propane tractor. Picked that up over at Weatherford, town not too far away from here. I believe it's a 57 model. Pretty cool little barn find project though. So I'll keep you filled in on how this project goes along. We're gonna head on out to the dealership this morning, pick up some parts and go check out this 9410R. Customer called and he's having some fault codes of a VGT actuator code, a 64107 code. And I've seen that before. I believe that's probably going to be his turbo linkage is probably worn, and so the turbo is not reaching the expected range that the engine controller would like to see. And then he's also getting a 109.03 code that talks about coolant pressure being out of range or sensor out of spec. And I believe I know what that problem is, and that's probably going to be to do with the wiring harness. And so we may be installing a new wiring harness on this tractor today. So I'll let you know how it turns out. We're out on this 9410R this morning with turbo codes and also coolant pressure codes. So we're going to dig into that a little deeper. Customer's already got it in the barn for us here today. We got a pretty good chance of thunderstorms this afternoon out here in southwest Oklahoma. I've got these codes, coolant pressure, and the coolant pressure sensor is located here. If you take a quick look, it's located here at the bottom of the water pump, and the coolant pressure is basically read by the ECU, and it's looking for a constant pressure parameter at this water pump, okay? And so it's not seeing that a lot of times and generating this 109 coolant pressure code, okay? So I think I've located the problem, and I'm gonna kind of show you real quick here what I believe is the problem. The wiring harness is pretty brittle, and the wires are kind of somewhat melted together within this harness, okay? And a lot of that is because of the heat that's generated by this EGR, okay? And the EGR is basically exhaust gas recirculation. And so it gets really super hot right in this area around the exhaust and pretty much kind of cooks that harness over a period of time. And so once that happens, the 3 wires inside of this harness start making continuity across those wires and then generating this 109 coolant pressure codes. Also, I want you to take a look real quick at our 641 Turbo Actuator VGT actuator code, and we're getting this code off and on with this machine, and I believe that's a result of this turbo linkage, okay? This actuator linkage is pretty loose and it's worn quite a bit over a period of time. It's got quite a few hours on it, and so we're going to replace that and try to eliminate his 641 VGT turbo actuator codes. And just real quick, what this actually does is this turbo actuator is moving constantly all day when this machine is running, and what it's doing essentially is changing the pitch of the exhaust side of the turbo. The exhaust side of the turbo is a turbine wheel, okay, and the vanes in that turbine wheel are mechanically actuated by the actuator so that it can change the pitch of those vanes to either speed up or slow the turbo down. And what it's doing is controlling the boost pressure, the pressure that the turbo puts into the engine through the intake side. Just real quick, that's one of the reasons I believe that we're getting these 641 codes is because of that linkage. And also, I'm going to climb down here real quick and I'm going to show you, get a look at this new harness. I want to show you real quick this exhaust pressure sensor connector here, and take a quick look and you can see they've put a pretty nice heat shield around that area where that harness gets really super hot. So that should eliminate a lot of problems in the future with this wiring harness and also with this coolant pressure code. And then real quick, I'll show you this one. I've had this issue before, not particularly on this machine, but also the EGR valve harness. And you can kind of see they've put a nice heat shield around that area of the EGR valve connector as well. And that's eliminated a lot of codes that we can get generated from wiring problems with engine wiring harness. So if you're getting a lot of these codes on these 9R tractors, a lot of that's just generated from wiring problems with the engine wiring harness. And usually we see that when we get quite a few hours on these machines. And so just a quick fix is just replace the harness. So many times that eliminates a lot of codes that are generated on these engines. So we're gonna get to work and see if we can get this engine harness replaced and that turbo actuator linkage, and we'll check back in with you guys in just a little while. Real quick, we've got the engine harness removed off of this tractor, and I'll give you a quick look at this harness. You can kind of see how the wires have gotten together inside of that harness and basically created this coolant pressure code. One thing that keep in mind when you're replacing this harness, that these two voltage wires, your 12-volt power supply for your ECU, has been modified on these tractors, on these earlier 9Rs. And so we've had to remove this connector, and we're going to have to install this connector on the new wiring harness. So basically I've extracted these two power wires out of this connector of the engine harness. Okay, so we're going to install this connector, and basically what that does is supplies a better 12-volt power source for the engine controller. So you might keep that in mind, that we do have to somewhat modify the new harness during installation by installing this jumper. Something else I like to do, and I'll show you this real quick. I've laid both of these harnesses out on the shop floor here. And the reason being is I like to do this. I like to lay my old harness out kind of like in the same direction that I pulled it off of the side of the engine. Okay, you can see our engine controller here. And I've seen this happen a lot of times. So our engine controller's here, and the way that wiring harness is routed along the side of this engine can get a little bit confusing. So what I like to do is lay that harness out on the floor, get my new harness, and make sure that all the bends and all the clamps are kind of somewhat the same direction, so that it makes it a lot easier during installation, and we don't have the harness all twisted up right in this area. I've seen that happen a lot of times where this was flipped over and twisted around, which puts a lot of strain and stress on the main part of our wiring harness where it connects to the ECU, the engine controller here. And so that's just a pretty good little quick tip to help you out during installation of this engine wiring harness. A little bit of information here on installing this new engine wiring harness. One thing I'd like to make mention of, and I like to call these P-clamps. And so these clamps that hold this harness in place in the different areas along this engine, when you're tightening these clamps up, and I've seen this happen a lot of times when guys tighten these clamps, they let it move the clamp as they're tightening, which essentially can put the harness in a bind, and then also cause this clamp to be in a position where it would wear into the harness and cause a wiring problem down the road. And so one thing to keep in mind when you're tightening these clamps up is try to orient that at the same position that the harness would normally set, and that way we're not wearing into this harness with our holder clamp. I want to show you something with this turbo actuator linkage. If you can see, I've got that linkage on the table here, and we'll take a quick look. And these little ball joints are really worn excessively, causing some quite a bit of slack in that turbo linkage. And then also we're going to take a quick look at the tractor. If you can see that, it's got the new linkage installed on the turbo actuator. Okay, and something I like to do is to make sure just by feel that the turbo actuator makes the full travel after installing the new linkage. I have seen a few times when you torque that screw on that arm, it kind of puts that linkage in a bind, so to speak. And then when it is in a bind, it will not make the full travel. Okay, and so right off of the key cycle, as soon as you turn the key on, this turbo actuator does a learn cycle and cycles. Okay, and when it doesn't see that full travel, then it will set a VGT turbo actuator code. I'm going to show you at a key cycle how the turbo actuator does a learn sequence. And so watch this linkage when I cycle the key switch, and you'll see what I'm talking about. So if you noticed, when I turned the key on, it done a quick like that and then done a full cycle. Okay, so what I was talking about earlier, if we get this in a bind during installation and it doesn't complete that full cycle, then we have turbo actuator codes as soon as we turn the key on. So keep that in mind. It's very important that we don't have any resistance in that motion of travel there on that turbo actuator linkage. So we're going to start the tractor up, see how it runs, and make sure that we've eliminated our VGT turbo codes and then also our coolant pressure codes. Give it a quick start up. We have no codes. Everything's returned to normal. And so we're going to send this tractor back to the field. Just finishing up out here on the 9410R with the engine wiring harness and the VGT turbo actuator linkage issue. And man, look at this wind blowing out here in southwest Oklahoma today. It is just like a dust bowl out here. I don't know if you can see that, but there's a big storm cloud back off in the northwest. Hopefully that's moving this way and will bring us some good, much needed rain. Quick recap on the issues that we had today on this 9410R. Customer's original complaint was we were getting a ECU 641.07, which was the VGT turbo actuator codes. And I believe those were a result of the linkage being worn. Okay, and so we replaced that linkage. And also keep in mind, we're talking about VGT turbo. That stands for variable geometry turbo. And so the actuator actually makes the turbo vary depending on engine load, okay, and how much boost that the engine really needs. And so that kind of controls that. And when that's out of that range and can't do its auto cal like I showed you earlier in the video, then we hit the 641 VGT turbo codes. And then also we can hit a 1531 derate, so a derate the power, and sometimes that would be a problem. Okay, and then also we were getting a coolant pressure code of an ECU 109.04, and we believe that the problem was because of the engine wiring harness. And so I showed you earlier in the video about the harness and how the harness gets a lot of heat damage from the engine. And you know, we're out here in these extreme conditions in southwest Oklahoma with these machines, and so it generates a lot of heat and a lot of wear and tear on wiring and other components on these engines and these tractors. And so I'm pretty sure we fixed that issue with the replacing the engine wiring harness. We started the machine, had no more codes. We returned the machine back to the field, and customer has replied back, thank you very much, and got him up and going, and not seeing any more fault codes at this moment. So thanks for watching. Larry the Tractor Guy signing out.